Welcome to Biblical Explorations. Today we're going to continue our examination of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Let's take a look at the whole verse and then go back and look at some of the details. Last time we talked about the first phrase of the verse. The earth or the land was without form and void. Now that could perhaps better be translated as a formless void or a formless waste or a chaotic wasteland, something like that. So that's phase one, or phrase one, that describes the land. The land is a formless waste. Secondly, they talk about the deep. Okay, darkness was upon the face of the deep. What the deep is, we'll discuss in just a second. So there's land, and then there's deep, and then there's a third thing that exists. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So there's land, deep, and waters. And if you structure this into its three elements, you can see the land was a formless waste. The deep, or the abyss, as we'll see, that's another way to translate this, was covered with darkness, and the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. So three things: land, deep, and waters. Now, the question is, and we'll look at the meaning of these phrases in a little bit more detail in a second, but the question is this describing what God is creating? In fact, God never is said to have created the darkness or the deep or the waters up to this point. Here it says, the beginning, God created the heavens or the skies and the land. Okay, fair enough. The question is that describing actually God creating them, or is this a title for the chapter, which is, here is the chapter about the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth? Two different ways to approach that. Now here it explicitly mentions God creating the earth, and here the earth is. Fair enough, that's fine at this point. But no mention of creation of darkness, no mention of creation of deep, and no mention of creation of waters. Now one could argue that darkness is simply the natural state of the universe without light. I don't know if the Hebrews conceptualized it that way, but nonetheless, deep and waters exist in verse 2 without having been explicitly said to have been created in verse 1. Now some people argue that verse 1, God creating the heavens or the skies and the land, is a Hebrew idiom meaning God created everything that was. That's possible that's what it means, but even if it does, it doesn't explain to us why everything else from verse 3 on is specifically described as being created by the God, including land and water, but the deep is not. So the question is, does the deep pre-exist creation? Is it the primordial matter? Is it the primordial chaotic ooze? Is it the unorganized matter from which God creates everything else? Or does God create the deep? Is God the creator of the deep? The Bible text doesn't say explicitly that he is. So some scholars think, yeah, maybe that's what it means, but it doesn't say it explicitly. Other scholars say no, darkness and deep and waters pre-existed God's creative acts, and what he's doing is turning water into land, bringing the land out of the water, confining the deep, creating space between waters, distinguishing between light and darkness, and so forth. Those are kind of two schools of interpretation, and I kind of go with the second one, that in fact the Bible is saying explicitly that things existed before God starts to create. That is, the deep, waters, darkness exist for certain, and probably land as well. Let's take a look at some of the details of this in the Hebrew text. Last time we looked at the eretz, or the land, was tohu vabohu, that is, formless void or chaotic wasteland, something along those lines. So that's phrase 1. The next phrase is choshek, that's simple, straightforward darkness, is upon the face of the Tehom. So darkness is upon the face of Tehom. That's an interesting word here. We need to take some time to look at its meaning. So we'll look it up in our dictionary. So what we've got here is the term Tehom, as it appears in this dictionary or lexicon. It gives us a whole bunch of background here of its meaning in different languages, Near Eastern languages, that's cognates and how it kind of is found and pops up in lots of different languages. And then it summarizes its meaning both in its broader concept, or context rather, but also specifically in the Hebrew Bible. So, meaning number one is the primeval ocean, the primeval flood. Okay, so the first thing to note is it's a liquid. Tehom is a liquid, but it seems to be different than sea and water. It's similar to, but probably different. It seems to be an integral element of that with which the world was created. For example, if we look here in Job, have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? So notice, this is God asking Job, what do you know about the cosmos? You don't know very much. Have you entered the springs of the sea, walked in the recesses of the deep? The deep here is Tehom. Flood and deluge. The Tehom is related to the flood story, and it talks about the Tehom flooding up and overcoming the land and kind of flowing over. So it's the flood, it's the Genesis. The fountains of the deep open in Genesis when the flood starts. All right? So there are springs that come forth out of the deep. Primeval flood, that type of an idea. So all of these concepts tell us that it's a liquid, it flows, but as we'll see in a moment, it's a water that's underneath the land, and it's kind of held in check by God's power, and that allows the land to appear when the deep is held in check. The term Tehom here, as it appears in the Old Testament. I did a search with accordance and found all the occurrences of Tehom. Here's the first one, Genesis 1:2, about the deep. Okay. Now notice when the flood occurs, the fountains of the deep burst forth. The fountains of the deep flow out, and that's what causes the flood. So the windows of heaven, that is the rains from the sky, and the fountains of the deep, the waters from underneath, they burst forth and they flood the entire universe. So deep is contrasted from heaven. It's the opposite. It's the cosmic opposite of heaven. Heaven is the highest thing. The deep, Tehom, is the lowest thing, and it's a watery place. The deeps congealed, the deeps solidified, and this is when Moses was able to lead the Israelites across the Red Sea, because the deeps turned solid. That's maybe what God is doing in his creation as well. Let's take a look now at a couple of examples from the Psalms, where we get a little bit more poetic. The mountains saw you, the waters raged, the deep gave forth its voice. So these are different aspects of the cosmos: mountains, waters, and deep. Maybe deep and waters are parallel and similar to some extent, but there are a distinction. See, the waters of the sea, God puts in a heap. That is, he collects them in together into this giant ocean. But the waters of the deep he puts in storehouses. That's interesting. The deeps here is Tehomot, so there's more than one. Just like there's more than one sky, there's more than one land, many different lands, there's more than one deep. So the deeps, or the Tehomot, are put in storehouses, as opposed to the waters of the sea, which are collected into this big pile, which is the ocean. Here you've got mountains. The judgment of God's range from the mountains, which are the highest thing on the earth, to the deep, which is the lowest thing on the earth, and it's underground. So lots of different examples of things like that are used in Hebrew that give us the basic concept of the deep as a place where it's a watery thing. It's kind of an unorganized and a flooding thing. It could be a destructive thing. And it seems to be the lowest thing in the cosmos, seems to be underneath the earth, as from several of those examples that we looked at, in contrast to the heavens, or the skies, which are the highest thing of the earth.